When Caitlin accepted the deal, she had no idea she was entering a dangerous game. Edward Montgomery wanted revenge, but ended up uncovering secrets that would change everything. Between lies, betrayals, and an unexpected passion, the truth might be the greatest threat of all. The sound of Isabella's heels echoed through the corridors of the luxurious office on the top floor of the Montgomery building. Edward observed the city through the panoramic window, his eyes fixed on the lights that were beginning to dot the horizon as the sun set. His fingers drummed on the solid mahogany desk, the only outward sign of the storm raging within him. "You can't be serious, Edward." Isabella's voice cut through the silence, laden with disdain. "All this drama over a simple business dinner?" Edward turned slowly, his face a mask of studied calm. "A business dinner? Is that what you call secret meetings with Gregory at La Maison?" Isabella adjusted the strap of her Hermès bag, a scornful smile playing on her perfectly outlined lips. "You've always been so controlling. That's why we need to end this. Gregory at least understands how the modern business world works." "Does the modern business world include cheating on your fiancée with your own cousin?" Edward asked, his voice low and controlled but laced with venom. "Don't be old-fashioned, Edward. You think you built your empire by being sentimental. Gregory and we understand each other. We have the same vision for the future, something that you, with your obsession with control and tradition, would never understand." Edward walked to his desk, picking up a leather folder. "Then perhaps this will interest you more than our relationship." He tossed some photos onto the glass table. "Your professional meetings seem quite intimate for my old-fashioned taste." Isabella's face paled for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "So you had me followed, typical. This only proves my point, you never trusted me." "With good reason, apparently." Edward sat in his chair, turning it to face the city again. "Our engagement is officially over. You can run and tell Gregory. I'm sure he'll be delighted." "You'll regret this, Edward." Isabella approached the desk, her red nails lightly scratching the polished surface. "You may have money and power, but you're alone, and you'll continue to be alone because no one can stand living in your shadow." The silence that followed was deafening. Edward didn't move, didn't respond. He just kept watching the city, as if Isabella was no longer there. Furious with his indifference, she spun on her heels and left, slamming the door hard enough to make the windows tremble. Only when the sound of her heels completely faded did Edward allow his mask of indifference to fall. His fist hit the desk, hard, knocking over the frame with the photo of the two of them in Bali just 3 months ago. The glass cracked, as did his last illusions about love and trust. At the Montgomery mansion, while the drama unfolded in the office, Caitlin methodically organized the library. Her fingers slid over the spines of the books as she arranged them, occasionally stopping to remove a volume and clean off the accumulated dust. It was her favorite place in the house, not only for the peace she found there, but because the books were her windows to a world that always seemed out of her reach. "Miss Caitlin." The voice of Rebecca, the housekeeper, interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Edward called. He's coming home early today and wants dinner at 7 sharp." Caitlin nodded, checking the antique clock on the wall. She still had enough time to finish the library and help in the kitchen. "Did he mention any preferences for dinner?" "No, and by the tone of his voice, it's better not to ask." Rebecca lowered her voice. "It seems the engagement is over. Mrs. Isabella, well, they say she left him for his cousin." Caitlin kept her face neutral, though inside a wave of conflicting feelings invaded her. She had never liked Isabella, who treated the staff as if they were invisible, but she also couldn't feel satisfaction at Edward's suffering, as arrogant as he was. "I'll finish up here and come down to help with dinner," she said simply, turning her attention back to the books. Rebecca hesitated at the door. "Caitlin, one, be especially careful today. The master might be different." Caitlin just nodded, but an involuntary shiver ran down her spine. She knew Edward Montgomery's temperament well, having worked in his house for 2 years. When crossed, he could be unpredictable. The sound of the private elevator announced his arrival hours later. Caitlin, who had just finished setting the dinner table impeccably, intended to discreetly retreat to the kitchen, but something made her stop in the hallway. Through the reflection in the Venetian mirror, she saw Edward enter, his shoulders tense, his tie loose, his eyes flashing with an intensity she had never seen before. Their gazes met in the mirror. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. There was something different in the way he looked at her, something calculated that made her heart race in alert. "Caitlin." His voice sounded hoarser than normal. "Prepare. Some me a drink in the study. We need to talk." She felt the weight of those words. In 2 years, Edward Montgomery had never asked to talk to her. He probably didn't even know her full name. As she followed him to the study, Caitlin couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change drastically. Edward's private study was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Caitlin served him his preferred whiskey, 2 ice cubes, as she knew he liked it. When she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Stay." It wasn't a request. "Sit down." Cautiously, she occupied one of the leather armchairs in front of his desk. Her hands intertwined in her lap, fingers nervously squeezing each other. "How long have you worked for me, Caitlin?" 2 years, sir." Edward swirled the glass between his fingers, watching the amber liquid dance. "And in 2 years, you've never lowered your head to me, never showed excessive fear or submission. Why?" The question caught her off guard. Caitlin hesitated, weighing her words. "Because respect is earned, sir, not imposed." An enigmatic smile crossed his lips. "Interesting." He stood up, approaching the window. "Do you have family, Caitlin?" "No, sir, I'm alone." "Even better." He turned, his eyes fixed on her with a disturbing intensity. "I have a proposal for you, a proposal that will completely change your life." Caitlin felt her heart race. Something in his tone, in the atmosphere of the room, said that what would come next would be much bigger than a simple change of function or salary increase. "I want you to marry me." The words fell like bombs in the silence of the office. Caitlin blinked several times, sure she had heard wrong. "Pardon?" "You heard me." Edward approached, leaning on the desk in front of her. "I'm proposing a deal. A marriage of convenience that will benefit us both. You'll have access to a life you never dreamed of having, and I—" He paused, his eyes darkening. "I'll have my revenge." The realization of what was happening hit Caitlin like a slap. "You want to marry me to provoke Mrs. Isabella?" "Perceptive." He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "So what's your answer?" Caitlin stood up slowly, her legs trembling slightly. "You're offering me a contract, not a marriage. What exactly would my role be in this farce?" "Your role would be to become Mrs. Montgomery. Learn to behave in high society, attend events, be seen. In exchange, you'll have everything you want. Clothes, jewelry, cars, a generous bank account. And how long would this arrangement last?" Edward shrugged. "As long as necessary. A year, maybe 2. Then we'd divorce discreetly, and you'd be left with a more than comfortable pension for the rest of your life." Caitlin walked to the window, needing a moment to organize her thoughts. The city sparkled below, a carpet of lights and possibilities. Her mind went back to the small apartment she shared with 2 roommates, to the always tight bills, to the dreams that seemed increasingly distant. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll continue to be just another maid, Caitlin. One among millions, in this city, struggling to survive month to month." He approached, his presence dominating the space. "But if you accept, you can have the world at your feet." She turned to face him, raising her chin. "I have some conditions." Edward raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her audacity. "Conditions?" "Yes, first I want to continue my studies. Second, I won't be treated like a decorative object. And third, if at any point I decide I no longer want to participate in this farce, I'll have the right to leave without repercussions." The silence that followed was tense. Edward studied her as if seeing her for the first time, a mixture of irritation and admiration in his gaze. "Are you in a position to make demands? You came to me, not the other way around." Caitlin kept her gaze steady. "If you want me to be your wife, even if it's pretend, you'll have to respect me as an equal." A slow smile formed on Edward's lips. "You're more interesting than I imagined, Caitlin. Perhaps this will work even better than I planned." He extended his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Caitlin looked at the outstretched hand, knowing that her answer would change the course of her life forever. With her heart thundering in her chest, she shook his hand. "We have a deal, Mr. Montgomery." "Edward," he corrected, his fingers squeezing hers firmly. "From now on, you call me Edward." That night, as Caitlin prepared for bed in her small room, at the back of the mansion, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed her hair, her reflection in the small mirror showing a woman she barely recognized. What Edward Montgomery didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that Caitlin carried her own secrets, secrets that, if revealed, could completely change the game he thought he controlled. As she put away the brush, her eyes fell on the small notebook hidden under her mattress, where she kept the truths that no one could discover, at least not yet. The sun had barely risen when Caitlin was awakened by firm knocks on her door. Rebecca, the housekeeper, looked even more serious than usual. "Mr. Edward wants you in the study in 15 minutes. Dress appropriately." The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes studying Caitlin with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "There are rumors circulating around the house. Is it true?" Caitlin adjusted her robe over her nightgown, keeping her expression neutral. "I can't comment on anything, Rebecca." The diplomatic response seemed to confirm the housekeeper's suspicions, who left shaking her head. Caitlin closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. The reality of what she had agreed to was beginning to weigh on her shoulders. Exactly 15 minutes later, she knocked on Edward's study door. She had chosen her best outfit, a black pencil skirt and a simple but elegant white blouse. Her hair was tied in a discreet bun. "Come in." Edward's voice sounded firm from the other side. He wasn't alone. An elegant woman, who appeared to be in her well-lived 50s, was sitting in one of the armchairs. Her shrewd eyes analyzed Caitlin from head to toe. "Caitlin, this is Beatrice Mendez, our image and protocol consultant." Edward gestured for her to sit down. "She will be responsible for your transformation." "Transformation?" Caitlin repeated, sitting with her back straight. "My dear," Beatrice began, her tone polite but firm, "you have exactly 3 weeks to become suitable to be presented to society as the future Mrs. Montgomery. It won't be an easy task." Edward remained standing, observing the interaction between the two women. "Beatrice is the best at what she does. She will oversee everything, your appearance, your wardrobe, your manners, your way of speaking." "And what about my work in the house?" Caitlin asked. An ironic smile curved Edward's lips. "As of today, you are no longer a maid. Rebecca has already been informed. Your things will be transferred to the main suite on the 2nd floor." Beatrice opened a leather agenda, consulting some notes. "We'll start immediately. Today we'll have consultations with stylists, dermatologist, hairdresser. We'll also start etiquette and protocol classes." "And what about my conditions?" Caitlin interrupted, her eyes meeting Edward's. "About continuing my studies?" Beatrice seemed surprised by the interruption, but Edward just nodded. "I've already arranged your enrollment at St. Mark's University. Business administration course, as you mentioned yesterday. Classes start next semester." The next hour was filled with Beatrice detailing an intensive transformation schedule. Caitlin listened attentively, but her mind wandered to the small notebook hidden in her room. She would need to find a new hiding place for it, somewhere no one could discover her secrets. "There's one more thing," Edward interrupted when Beatrice finished her explanation. "This afternoon we'll give an exclusive interview to Elite magazine. The engagement announcement needs to be controlled, presented in the right way." "So soon?" Caitlin couldn't hide her surprise. "The sooner the better." Edward's eyes glimmered with something close to satisfaction. "I imagine Isabella is already savoring her victory. I can't wait to see her reaction." The morning passed like a whirlwind. Caitlin was taken from consultation to consultation, her body and appearance being analyzed and discussed as if she were a work of art needing restoration. Lunch was served at an exclusive restaurant, where Beatrice took the opportunity to give the first lessons on wines and table etiquette. "Back straight, chin parallel to the ground," Beatrice instructed. "Your movements should be smooth, controlled. You're no longer a maid running to serve dinner. You're the future lady of an empire." The words hit Caitlin with unexpected force. It was true. In a matter of hours, her life had completely turned around. The waiter serving them now bowed respectfully, the same man who, weeks ago, would hardly have noticed her presence. At 4 in the afternoon, they returned to the Montgomery mansion. A makeup and hair team was already waiting, along with a fashion consultant carrying various pieces of clothing. Caitlin was transformed in record time when she finally looked. At herself in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her hair, previously always tied in a severe bun, fell in soft waves framing her face. The makeup, although apparently natural, enhanced her features in a surprising way. The navy blue dress, made of a fabric she would never have dared to touch before, hugged her curves elegantly. "Perfect," Beatrice murmured, satisfied. "Edward will be impressed." As if summoned, he appeared at the bedroom door. His gaze slowly traveled over Caitlin, an enigmatic expression on his face. "The journalist has arrived," he announced, still observing Caitlin. "She's waiting for us in the winter garden." The reporter from Elite magazine, Caroline Torres, was an elegant woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her professional smile barely disguised her voracious curiosity for the unlikely story she was about to cover. "So, how did you two meet?" Caroline asked, her recorder strategically positioned between them. Edward, sitting close to Caitlin on the light leather sofa, took the initiative. "It was something gradual. Caitlin worked in my house for 2 years, but I confess that at first I hardly noticed her presence. It was her unique way of being, her silent strength that began to catch my attention." Caitlin maintained the serene smile that Beatrice had practiced with her, but inside her heart was racing. The ease with which Edward lied was disturbing. "And you, Caitlin? What attracted you to Edward Montgomery?" She felt his hand lightly squeeze her knee, a silent warning, but Caitlin already had her answer prepared. "His dedication," she replied, her voice firm. "Not just to business, but to everything he does. Edward is a man who knows what he wants and spares no effort to achieve his goals." The irony of her words didn't go unnoticed by Edward, who looked at her with a mixture of surprise and approval. "And the fact that you worked as a maid didn't bother him?" Caroline pressed, her eyes gleaming with barely disguised malice. "Why should it?" Edward replied, his voice loaded with authority. "Caitlin is an extraordinary woman, regardless of her origin. In fact, her humility and work ethic are qualities I deeply admire." The interview continued for another hour, with questions, carefully navigated by both. When Caroline finally left, Caitlin felt exhausted. Playing a role, she discovered, was more tiring than she had imagined. "You did well," Edward commented, pouring himself a drink as soon as they were alone. "Better than I expected, actually." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," she replied, a touch of sarcasm in her voice. He studied her for a moment, an enigmatic smile on his lips. "You know what intrigues me most about you, Caitlin? Your ability to keep secrets. There's something in your eyes, a story you're not telling." The comment caught her off guard. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her, but years of practice in hiding her emotions saved her. "We all have our secrets, don't we?" she replied, holding his gaze. "Including you." Edward laughed, a low and dangerous sound. "Touché." He approached, adjusting a strand of her hair that had escaped. "But don't forget, Caitlin, now your secrets are mine too. If there's anything that could harm us, you'd better tell me now." She felt a shiver run down her spine, but maintained her composure. "There's nothing to worry about. I am exactly who you see." The lie came smooth as silk from her lips, but the weight of the hidden notebook seemed to burn in her conscience. Edward nodded, apparently satisfied, but his eyes said the conversation wasn't over. That night, alone in her new luxurious suite, Caitlin allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. Sitting on the edge of the king-size bed, she opened the notebook she had managed to discreetly transfer among her things. The yellowed pages contained not only her secrets, but also the keys to a past that could destroy everything, including Edward's revenge plan. Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made her blood freeze. "Saw your photo on Elite magazine's Instagram. Thought you had disappeared off the map, Bethany. Or should I say, Caitlin. With trembling hands, she deleted the message. Her past, which she thought she had buried so long ago, was starting to emerge, and she knew it was only a matter of time before more ghosts came knocking at her door. The Millennium Club was the epicenter of power in New York City. Its century-old walls held secrets of generations of traditional families, and its main hall had witnessed countless deals that shaped the destiny of business empires. That night, the club was hosting its traditional charity gala, an event that brought together the cream of New York society. And it would be Caitlin's first public appearance as Edward Montgomery's fiancée. "Take a deep breath," Beatrice instructed, adjusting Caitlin's red haute couture dress one last time. "Remember everything we practiced. You're ready." Caitlin observed her reflection in the mirror of the improvised dressing room. 2 weeks of intensive preparation had worked miracles. Her posture, her way of walking, even her tone of voice had been meticulously worked on. But there was something that no training could mask, the fear growing in her chest since she had received that mysterious message. "The car is ready," Edward announced, entering the dressing room. He paused for a moment, his eyes traveling over Caitlin's figure with an intensity that made her blush. "You look stunning. Thank you." She adjusted the ruby necklace he had given her earlier, a piece from the Montgomery collection, as he had made a point of mentioning. "Is it time?" Edward offered his arm. "Let's give them something to talk about." The club's main hall was packed. Hundreds of high society people circulated between tables decorated with elaborate arrangements of white orchids. The soft music from the orchestra filled the environment, but couldn't completely drown out the buzz of conversations and speculations. The couple's entrance caused the expected effect. Conversations diminished, heads turned, curious and critical glances followed them as they crossed the hall. Caitlin maintained the serene smile she had practiced so much, but her fingers lightly squeezed Edward's arm. "Relax," he murmured, guiding her among the guests. "You're doing perfectly." That's when she saw her. Isabella looked stunning in a sapphire blue dress, her arm entwined with Gregory's. Their eyes met across the hall, and Edward's ex-fiancée's smile faltered for a moment. "Edward, darling," an elegant lady approached, interrupting the moment of tension. "What a wonderful surprise. And this must be your fiancé?" The introductions began. Caitlin was introduced to dozens of people whose names she had memorized during her lessons with Beatrice. She answered questions with studied grace, always maintaining that air of mystery that Edward had suggested. "Caitlin is a rare gem I found where I least expected," Edward commented to a group of businessmen. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back. "Sometimes true value is hidden right under our noses." The double meaning of his words didn't go unnoticed. Several glances were discreetly directed to where Isabella was now visibly uncomfortable. "And business, Edward?" Gregory approached, his calculated smile not reaching his eyes. "I heard rumors about a possible merger with the Chinese." "My business is going very well, cousin." Edward's tone was polite but icy. "But I'm sure you already know that, considering your special interest in my activities." The tension was palpable. Caitlin observed the interaction carefully, noticing how Isabella seemed restless beside Gregory. There was something in her eyes, fear. "Caitlin, isn't it?" Isabella finally spoke, her tone too sweet to be sincere. "What a lovely dress. Hermes?" "Valentino," Caitlin corrected softly. "Edward has impeccable taste in gifts." Isabella's smile trembled slightly. That had been her territory for so long. The expensive gifts, the exclusive jewelry, the status of being by Edward Montgomery's side. And now, a former maid occupied her place. "If you'll excuse me," Isabella murmured, quickly moving away. Gregory followed her after casting a calculated look at the couple. "First round ours," Edward whispered in Caitlin's ear, guiding her to the dance floor. The orchestra was beginning a soft waltz. As they danced, Caitlin couldn't help but notice how well their bodies fit together. Edward was an excellent dancer, and the intensive lessons of the past few weeks had paid off. She accompanied him with natural grace. "You exceeded my expectations today," he commented, his lips close to her ear. "You're playing the game better than I imagined." "Maybe because it's not the first time I've played," she replied without thinking, and immediately regretted it. Edward spun her, his eyes meeting hers with renewed intensity. "What do you mean by that?" Before she could answer, they were interrupted by a commotion near the bar. Isabella had dropped her champagne flute, the golden liquid staining her expensive dress. But it wasn't this that caught Caitlin's attention. It was the man who had just entered the hall. Tall, elegant, with graying hair at the temples, he seemed out of place among the club's regulars. His eyes scanned the environment until they found Caitlin, and a disturbing smile curved his lips. "You've gone pale," Edward noticed, following her gaze. "Do you know that man?" "No," she answered too quickly. I'm not feeling very well. The champagne, perhaps." Edward frowned, but before he could question further, they were surrounded by another group of guests wanting to meet the new Mrs. Montgomery. The night continued, an endless parade of smiles, polite conversations, and dances. But Caitlin could barely concentrate. The man had disappeared as mysteriously as he had arrived, but his presence had awakened memories she struggled to keep buried. When they finally entered the limousine to return home, Caitlin was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Her past was beginning to catch up with her, and she knew she needed to act fast. "You were extraordinary today," Edward commented, pouring himself a drink at the limousine's bar. "Isabella was furious, exactly as I planned." Caitlin just nodded, her mind still on the mysterious man from the club. She needed to find a way to protect her secrets, or Edward's entire plan could crumble, and with it, the new life she was beginning to build. "However," he continued, his tone subtly changing, "I noticed something interesting. You don't seem like a novice in this kind of environment. Your gestures, your way of carrying yourself, there are moments when they seem almost too natural." She forced a smile. "Beatrice is an excellent teacher." "Or perhaps," Edward leaned towards her, his penetrating eyes, "you've lived something like this before. There's a lot about you that I don't know, isn't there, Caitlin?" The use of her name, the name she now used, sounded like a veiled warning. Caitlin kept her face impassive, years of practice in hiding her emotions coming to the surface. "We all have a past, Edward, including you." He laughed, but the sound had no humor. "Touché, but remember our agreement. There can be no surprises that compromise our plans." The limousine stopped smoothly in front of the Montgomery mansion. Before the driver could open the door, Edward held Caitlin's wrist, his touch gentle but firm. "One more thing," he said, his voice low. "That man at the club, the way you reacted when you saw him. If there's something I should know." "There's nothing," she interrupted, forcing her voice to remain calm. "As you said, it was a tiring night. The champagne, the heat, the people. I just need to rest." Edward studied her for a long moment before releasing her. "Of course, tomorrow we have an important day, the meeting with the company's board." Caitlin nodded, grateful for the change of subject. But as she climbed the stairs to her suite, her cell phone vibrated again. Another message from the unknown number. "Beautiful party, Bethany. Or should I keep calling you Caitlin? We need to talk, you know you can't run forever." With trembling hands, she deleted the message. In her room, she retrieved the notebook from its hiding place and added another entry. Her past was rapidly approaching, and she needed to be prepared for when the truth came to light. Because one thing she had learned in her previous life, secrets have the nasty habit of emerging at the most inconvenient moments. And when that happened, she would need to be ready to face not only her past, but also the man who now controlled her future, Edward Montgomery. The conference room of Montgomery Enterprises occupied the entire top floor of the building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York stretched out like a carpet of concrete and glass under the blue morning sky. Caitlin observed the city, while the board members took their places around the black marble table. Edward was in his element, commanding the meeting with the natural authority of someone born to lead. Wearing an impeccable Italian suit, he presented the results of the last quarter with the precision of a surgeon. And now, he made a calculated pause, his eyes scanning the attentive faces of the board members. "I'd like to officially introduce my fiancée, Caitlin, who from today will participate in our strategic meetings." The surprise was evident on the faces of those present. Albert Mendoza, the oldest board member, was the first to speak up. "With all due respect, Edward, but is it appropriate to have your fiancée participating in such sensitive meetings?" "Caitlin is not just my fiancée," Edward replied with an enigmatic smile. "She's studying business administration, and I consider it fundamental that she starts understanding the workings of our business from now on." What Edward didn't mention, and Caitlin knew very well, was that her presence there had another purpose. The news of her participation in board meetings would certainly reach Isabella and Gregory's ears. "If I may," Caitlin spoke up, her voice calm and controlled, "I'd like to share some observations about the International Expansion Report." Edward raised an eyebrow, surprised. This wasn't in the script they had rehearsed. "During my analysis of the documents," she continued, opening an elegant folder, "I noticed some inconsistencies in the projections for the Asian market, specifically regarding the joint venture with the Nakamura Group." A tense silence fell over the room. This was a delicate subject. The negotiation with the Japanese was at a crucial stage, and any mistake could compromise months of work. "If you observe page 47, Caitlin proceeded, her confidence growing, "the growth estimates seem too optimistic considering the recent slowdown in the Tokyo market. Moreover, the currency risk analysis didn't take into account the new monetary policies of the Japanese central bank." Edward watched her with a mixture of surprise and something else. Distrust? Admiration? Caitlin continued her analysis, pointing out details that only someone with deep knowledge of international business could notice. "Impressive, Miss Caitlin," Albert commented when she finished. "Your analysis is surprisingly accurate." "Thank you," she replied with a modest smile. "I try to stay updated on the global market." The meeting continued, but Caitlin could feel Edward's gaze on her. She had risked a lot with that display of knowledge, but she needed to establish her presence. If her past came to light, the more value she had for the company, the harder it would be for Edward to discard her. After the meeting, while the board members were saying goodbye, Edward led her to his private office. As soon as the door closed, he turned to face her. "Where did you learn so much about international markets?" "I read a lot," she answered, keeping her tone casual. "And I pay attention." "No," he approached, his eyes fixed on hers. "That kind of analysis requires practical experience, knowledge that isn't obtained just by reading financial reports." Caitlin held his gaze. "Maybe I'm more capable than you imagined when you chose me for your revenge. Or maybe," he circled around her like a predator, "you're not exactly who you say you are." The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Helen, the executive secretary, entered hurriedly. "Mr. Montgomery, sorry for the interruption, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention. Reuters is trying to confirm rumors about a possible hostile takeover of Montgomery by Ferraz Enterprises." Edward's face hardened. "Gregory," he murmured, "so that's what he's planning." "Should I prepare an official statement?" Helen asked. "No," Caitlin intervened, surprising both of them. "An official response would only give credibility to the rumors. I suggest a strategic leak to the market about our expansion in Asia. That will divert attention and force Gregory to defend himself." Edward studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Do as she suggests, Helen, and schedule an emergency meeting with our IR team for this afternoon." When they were alone again, Edward poured 2 glasses of wine. He offered one to Caitlin, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "You're a box of surprises, aren't you?" he commented, his voice a mix of admiration and suspicion. "Every day I discover a new facet of you." "Isn't that what you wanted?" she retorted. "Someone who could be up to the Montgomery name?" "Yes, but..." He paused, choosing his words. "I'm starting to wonder if it wasn't me who fell into some kind of trap." Caitlin felt her heart race, but maintained her composure. "What kind of trap could I set? You're Edward Montgomery. I was just your maid." "Was?" He raised an eyebrow. "Or are you still part of some bigger plan that I'm unaware of?" Before she could answer, her cell phone vibrated. Another message from the unknown number. "Nice performance at the meeting, Bethany. Your business talents haven't rusted, it seems. But how long do you think you can keep up this charade? Caitlin quickly deleted the message, but not before Edward noticed her disturbance. Something wrong? No, she forced a smile. Just Beatrice confirming my schedule for tomorrow. He didn't seem convinced, but was interrupted by Helen again, this time with news about the market's reaction to the leak about the Asian expansion. Caitlin took the opportunity to excuse herself, claiming an appointment with the wedding planner. Instead, she headed to the only place where she felt safe, the library of the Montgomery mansion. Among the old shelves, she found her usual refuge, a hidden corner where she used to hide during her days as a maid. She retrieved the notebook from its hiding place and added another entry. The walls are closing in. He's getting closer and closer, and Edward is starting to ask the right questions. I need to find a way to protect my past without losing everything I've gained. The irony is that, for the first time, it's not just about survival. There's something more at stake now. Her thoughts were interrupted by approaching footsteps. She quickly put away the notebook and pretended to be absorbed in a book on business strategy. Caitlin, Rebecca's voice echoed among the shelves. There's a call for you on the private line. A man. He said it's about your past in Boston. Her blood ran cold. Boston, the city where it all began, where Bethany had disappeared and Caitlin had been born. Tell him I'm not here, she answered, proud that her voice didn't tremble. In fact, tell him he dialed the wrong number. Rebecca hesitated. He said it was urgent. Something about an old investment. Rebecca, Caitlin stood up, her tone firmer. Please do as I asked. Alone again, Caitlin allowed the mask of control to fall for a moment. Her past was rapidly approaching, and she knew that soon she would have to make a choice, continue running or face her ghosts. And then there was Edward. The man who had chosen her as an instrument of revenge was becoming something more, a variable she hadn't foreseen in her calculations. The way he sometimes looked at her, with a mixture of distrust and fascination, made her heart beat faster than it should. Her cell phone vibrated once more. This time, it was a message from Edward. Dinner at 8. Just the two of us. We have a lot to talk about. Caitlin closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. The night would be long and she needed to be prepared. Because one thing was certain, she could no longer postpone the inevitable. Her past and her present were about to collide, and she needed to decide which version of herself would survive the impact. Le Noir restaurant occupied the top floor of New York City's most exclusive building. With only 5 tables, it was where the city's most important decisions were made away from the spotlight. Edward had reserved the entire space for that night. Caitlin adjusted her black Chanel dress, another strategically chosen gift from Edward, as the maître led them to the main table. The view of the nighttime city was breathtaking, but she could barely appreciate it. The tension between them was almost palpable. Champagne to start, Edward suggested, his tone too casual to be natural. I prefer to be sober for this conversation, she replied, holding his gaze. An enigmatic smile curved his lips. Always so perceptive. It's one of the things that intrigues me most about you, Caitlin. Or should I say, Bethany. The name hit her like a slap. She kept her expression neutral, years of practice in hiding her emotions coming to the surface. So you've been investigating? Naturally, Edward made a gesture dismissing the sommelier. It would be irresponsible of me not to check the background of the woman I chose to be my wife, even if for convenience. And what exactly did you discover? Curiously, very little. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. Caitlin Smith seems to have emerged from nowhere 3 years ago. No prior records. It's as if you had simply appeared. She took a sip of water, buying time to organize her thoughts. Not everyone has the privilege of an important surname like Montgomery. Don't change the subject. His voice hardened. Who is Bethany? And why did that man at the club call you by that name? Before Caitlin could answer, her cell phone vibrated discreetly. Another message from the familiar number. Last chance, Bethany. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., Antique Cafe. Come alone, or Edward will know everything, including what really happened to the investor's money. Aren't you going to check? Edward asked, noticing her hesitation. It's not important. She put away the phone, but her hands trembled slightly. "I know what's fascinating," he continued, pouring himself some wine. "In the same period that Caitlin Smith appeared in New York, an executive named Bethany Carter disappeared from Boston. A brilliant woman who had built an impressive career in the financial market until, she challenged him, her heart pounding in her chest. Until an investment scheme collapsed, leaving dozens of people affected. The police never found the person responsible or the money. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the city continued its ballet of lights, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the restaurant. "Why are you telling me this?" Caitlin finally asked. "Because I need to know if I've brought a snake into my house." Edward leaned forward. "If you really are who you say you are, or if you're part of some bigger plan, perhaps sent by Gregory." The accusation caught her by surprise. "You think I work for Gregory? The timing is perfect, isn't it?" He shrugged. "A mysterious maid who wins my trust right after my breakup with Isabella, who demonstrates surprising knowledge of business and the financial market. You're being paranoid." "Am I?" Edward laughed humorlessly. "Then explain to me how a simple domestic employee can make such an accurate analysis of the Asian market. How does she know so well the intricacies of the corporate world?" Caitlin straightened her shoulders. It was time to change strategy. "What if I tell you there's more to me than you imagine? That maybe I have my own reasons for being here? Now we're getting somewhere." He smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Go on." "You're not the only one with a complicated past, Edward, nor the only one with a thirst for revenge." The confession hung between them like smoke. Edward studied her for a long time, as if trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "Gregory," he said finally, "he has something to do with your past." "Not directly." Caitlin chose her words carefully. "But he knows people who know my past, people who can complicate things for both of us. So you admit there's something to complicate?" Before she could answer, her cell phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from Gregory. "We need to talk, Caitlin. Or should I say, Miss Carter, I have a proposal that might interest you. And your former investors." Edward noticed her pallor. "Bad news?" "Nothing important." She forced a smile, but her mind was working frantically. How had Gregory found out? And what did he really want? "You know what's interesting?" Edward continued, twirling the wine glass between his fingers. "After the board meeting today, I received a curious call, someone wanting to alert me about a possible fraud involving one of our subsidiaries in Asia. The timing is convenient." Caitlin felt her blood run cold. "What exactly are you insinuating?" "That maybe you're not the only one playing a game here." He leaned forward. "Gregory might be using your past, whatever it is, to try to destabilize me. The question is, whose side are you really on?" "My own side," she answered honestly. "I always have been." An enigmatic smile curved Edward's lips. "Finally, an honest answer." He paused, studying her. "I propose a new deal." "What kind of deal?" "You tell me everything. About your past. About Bethany, about the missing money. In exchange, I guarantee your protection. Against Gregory, against your former associates, against whoever is threatening you." Caitlin felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. "And why would I trust you?" "Because," he smiled, a predatory smile that made her shiver, "unlike Gregory, I can actually offer what you need. A fresh start. Clean. Definitive." The silence that followed was heavy with possibilities. Outside, the city continued its nocturnal ballet, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the restaurant. Caitlin realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue running from her past, or face it once and for all. "Tomorrow," she said finally. "There's something I need to resolve first, then I'll tell you everything." Edward nodded slowly. "Don't make me regret this decision, Caitlin, or Bethany, whoever you really are." When they left the restaurant, hours later, Caitlin knew she had just made a risky bet. The meeting scheduled for tomorrow at the antique cafe could change everything, or destroy everything she had built. In her room that night, she opened the notebook one more time. Her last entry was short. Tomorrow, all paths cross. I just hope I have the strength to face the consequences of my choices, and maybe, just maybe, find redemption in the arms of the man who was supposed to be just part of my revenge. The Antique Cafe was a discreet establishment in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, frequented mainly by intellectuals and artists who appreciated its retro atmosphere and the privacy it offered. Caitlin arrived exactly at 2:45 p.m., choosing a table in the back with a view of the entrance. She had chosen a simple outfit for the meeting: jeans, a black blazer, and a discreet handbag. Nothing of the Caitlin that Edward had created, much less of the Bethany she had left behind in Boston. It was just herself, for the first time in a long time. At 3 p.m. sharp, he entered. Richard Mendez hadn't changed much in the last 3 years. The same well-cut suit, the same graying hair at the temples, the same predatory air disguised as a gentleman. "Bethany," he smiled, pulling out the chair in front of her. "Or should I say, Caitlin, you're even more beautiful than I remember." "What do you want, Richard?" She was direct, her hands squeezing the coffee cup to disguise the tremor. "Straight. To the point, as always." He gestured to the waiter ordering an espresso. "You know, it was very clever of you to hide as a maid in the Montgomery house. No one would think to look there. But then you got too ambitious, didn't you?" "You don't. I know what you're talking about, don't I?" He leaned forward. "Then explain to me why the brilliant Bethany Carter, the darling of Boston's financial market, is pretending to be Edward Montgomery's fiancée." Caitlin kept her face impassive. What happened in Boston stayed in the past. Did the investors' money stay in the past too? Richard smiled when she paled. $15 million don't evaporate like that, darling, especially when half of that money was mine. You know very well what happened to that money, Richard, and you also know that I have proof. It was his turn to pale slightly. "Proof? Why do you think I'm still alive?" She leaned forward. "The flash drive with all the details of your participation in the scheme is very well guarded. One wrong move and everything comes to light." Richard quickly regained his composure. "Interesting. But you're not the only one with cards up your sleeve, Bethany, or should I mention Sarah's name?" The name hit Caitlin like a punch. Her hands trembled, spilling a few drops of coffee on the table. "Leave her out of this." "Ah, so you still care about your little sister?" He smiled, pleased to have found her weak spot. "How do you think Edward would react to knowing that his perfect fiancée has a sister institutionalized in a psychiatric clinic in Boston? A sister who went mad after losing all her savings in a financial scheme." "It was you," Caitlin hissed, anger replacing fear. "You manipulated the numbers, convinced investors to put in more money. I only realized it too late. And yet you ran away with the money. To protect the evidence, you would have destroyed everything, made it look like I was the only one responsible." Richard took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the cup. "You know what's fascinating? How fate puts us in ironic situations. You, fleeing a financial scandal, end up engaged to the most powerful man in New York. And now you're about to lose everything again." "What do you mean?" "Gregory Ferraz is my new partner." Richard's smile was predatory. Imagine my surprise when he approached me, interested in information about a certain Bethany Carter. Apparently he's very interested in destabilizing Edward Montgomery. Caitlin felt her blood run cold. "So that's it? You and Gregory are working together. Let's say we have mutual interests." Richard checked the gold watch on his wrist. "I have a proposal for you. The flash drive in exchange for your freedom. No scandals, no revelations about Sarah. You can even keep your disguise with Edward if you can manage it. And if I refuse, then Gregory receives all the information about your past tomorrow, including the details about how you manipulated your own sister's investments." "I never did that." Caitlin raised her voice, attracting curious glances. Lowering her tone, she continued, "You know I tried to stop it. I tried to warn Sarah, but she trusted you so much. And who will Edward believe? You, a former maid with a false identity, or Gregory Ferraz backed by documents and witnesses?" The coffee had gone cold, as had the air between them. Caitlin felt cornered, but years of survival had taught her never to show weakness. How long do I have to decide? Until noon tomorrow. Richard stood up, adjusting his jacket. The flash drive for your freedom. It's a fair trade. After he left, Caitlin remained seated, her mind working frantically. She had underestimated Gregory. He wasn't just trying to get at Edward through her, but had found a way to destroy them both. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Edward. Emergency meeting at the office. Gregory made a formal offer to buy Montgomery Enterprises. Caitlin closed her eyes, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. It wasn't just about revenge or money. It was about power. Gregory wanted the company, and he was willing to use all resources to get it. When she left the cafe, her decision was made. She could no longer run, it was time to fight. But first, she needed to make a visit she had postponed for 3 years. The taxi dropped her off in front of a private clinic on the outskirts of the city. The place was elegant and discreet, with well-tended gardens and attentive security. "I'm here to visit Sarah Carter," she informed the reception, using her real surname for the first time in years. The nurse led her through silent corridors to an inner garden, where a young woman of about 30 was sitting on a bench, painting. Her features were similar to Caitlin's, but her eyes had a distant, lost gleam. "Sarah," Caitlin called softly. "Her." Sister looked up, and for a moment a flash of recognition crossed her face. "Beth, is it you?" The old nickname made her heart ache. She sat down next to her sister, observing the painting, an abstract landscape in shades of blue and grey. "It's beautiful," she commented, indicating the painting. "The colors help me organize my thoughts," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "Sometimes when I paint I can remember, before everything got confused." "Sarah, forgive me," Caitlin whispered, tears escaping her eyes. "I should have protected you better." "You tried to warn me about him," Sarah continued painting, not raising her eyes. "About Richard, but I didn't want to listen. I was so proud of the investments, the profits, and then everything disappeared. It wasn't your fault, nor yours." Sarah finally looked at her. "You ran away to protect the evidence, didn't you? To one day be able to prove the truth." Caitlin was shocked. You know." "I have moments of clarity," Sarah smiled sadly, "and in those moments I remember everything, the flash drive, the documents, how Richard manipulated all of us." "Sarah, You don't need to explain." Her sister went back to painting. "But be careful, Beth. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." When Caitlin left the clinic hours later, her determination was renewed. She couldn't hand over the flash drive to Richard, not after seeing what he had done to Sarah, but she also couldn't allow Gregory to destroy Edward. Her cell phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Gregory. "Meeting in an hour at Montgomery Enterprises. I hope you've made the right decision, Bethany. There's a lot at stake." Caitlin got into her car, her mind already tracing a plan. It was time to stop reacting and start acting. Richard and Gregory wanted war? Then war they would have. But first, she needed to do one thing: tell Edward the whole truth. Because if there was a chance to win this battle, she would need someone she could completely trust. And surprisingly, the man she had planned to use as an instrument of revenge had become the only person she really wanted to trust. Montgomery Enterprises was bustling with activity when Caitlin arrived. Executives hurried through the corridors, all feeling the tension in the air. Gregory's hostile offer had taken everyone by surprise, and the market was already reacting. The company's shares had fallen 5% just that afternoon. Edward was waiting for her in his office, his tie slightly loose and his shirt sleeves rolled up, clear signs that the situation was serious. When she entered, he was on the phone, his voice tense as he argued with someone. "I don't care what the board thinks," he was saying. "This company is not for sale, especially not to Gregory Faraz." Seeing her, he gestured for her to wait. Caitlin took the moment to organize her thoughts. She had mentally rehearsed dozens of times what she would say, how she would explain everything. But now, facing the moment, the words seemed inadequate. "The lawyers are reviewing the proposal," Edward informed after hanging up. "Gregory will arrive in 15 minutes for the meeting. We need a strategy." "Edward," she interrupted, her voice firm despite her nervousness. "Before anything else, I need to tell you the truth. All of it." He studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I'm all ears." Caitlin took a deep breath. "My real name is Bethany Carter. 3 years ago, I was one of the most respected executives in Boston's financial market." For the next 10 minutes, she told him everything. About the investment scheme, about how Richard Mendez had manipulated the numbers, about her sister Sarah and the missing money. Her voice trembled only when she mentioned how she had found Sarah that afternoon, still struggling with the aftermath of the trauma. "The flash drive," Edward interrupted when she mentioned the evidence. "Where is it?" "In a safe place." She hesitated. "Richard is working with Gregory now. They gave me until tomorrow to hand over the flash drive in exchange." For my silence, Edward stood up, walking to the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New York sky in shades of orange and red. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I'm tired of running," she approached him. "And because you deserve to know the truth before deciding if you still want to help me." He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "And our agreement, the marriage of convenience, was that also part of some bigger plan?" "No." Caitlin held his gaze. "It was fate playing a trick. I really was just your maid when you chose me, but now. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Helen, the secretary, announced, "Mr. Montgomery, Gregory Ferraz has arrived with his lawyers." Edward adjusted his tie, his expression returning to ruthless businessman mode. "Have them wait in the conference room." Turning to Caitlin, he added, "This conversation isn't over." The conference room was full when they entered. Gregory occupied one end of the table, surrounded by lawyers and executives. His confident smile faltered slightly upon seeing Caitlin next to Edward. "Cousin," he greeted with false cordiality. "And Caitlin, or should I say Bethany?" The silence that followed was deafening. Edward, however, showed no surprise. He just smiled, a cold smile that Caitlin had never seen before. "You know, Gregory," he began, sitting down calmly, "it's fascinating how fate works. Did you really think I wouldn't investigate the background of the woman I chose to be my wife?" Gregory frowned, clearly disconcerted. "So, you know? About Bethany Carter? About the scheme in Boston? About Richard Mendez?" Edward laughed softly. "Please give me more credit." Caitlin observed the interaction with growing admiration. Edward wasn't just protecting her, he was turning the game around. "What really intrigues me," Edward continued, "is why you allied yourself with someone like Richard Mendez, a man known for, let's say, questionable financial practices." "This has nothing to do with the buyout offer," one of Gregory's lawyers intervened. "On the contrary." Edward opened a folder in front of him. "It has everything to do with it. Because while you were busy investigating Caitlin's past, we were investigating the sources of the funds for this supposed purchase." Gregory visibly paled. "What are you talking about?" $15 million, Caitlin intervened, her voice clear and firm. "The same amount that disappeared in Boston. Curious, isn't it?" "This is ridiculous," Gregory tried to maintain his composure. "The funds for the purchase come from legitimate investors. Like your cousin Isabella," Edward smiled, "who coincidentally sold all her Montgomery shares 2 weeks before this offer. The market would be very interested to know about this insider trading." The mood in the room changed perceptibly. Gregory's lawyers began to whisper among themselves, clearly concerned. "You have no proof," Gregory challenged, but his voice betrayed his insecurity. "No?" Edward looked at Caitlin, who nodded slightly. "Bethany, dear, why don't you show them the contents of the flash drive?" With steady hands, Caitlin connected a device to the room's laptop. On the big screen, documents began to appear. Emails, bank transfers, records of secret meetings between Richard and Gregory. "How?" Gregory began, but his voice failed. "Did you really think Richard Mendez would be loyal to you?" Caitlin asked, almost with pity. "He tried to destroy me 3 years ago. Why would it be different with you?" "This meeting is over," Gregory's lead lawyer announced, starting to gather his papers. "Mr. Ferraz, I suggest we withdraw to reassess our position." When the room emptied, leaving only Edward and Caitlin, the silence that followed was charged. with unspoken emotions. "How long have you known," she finally asked, "about your past, from the beginning?" Edward approached her. The question was, would you trust me enough to tell me the truth? Why didn't you say anything? For the same reason you hid, protection. He touched her face softly. But now we don't need to hide from each other anymore. Caitlin felt tears in her eyes. What happens now? Now? Edward smiled, a genuine smile this time. Now we finish what we started, but not for revenge, for us. At that moment, looking into the eyes of the man who was supposed to be just part of her disguise, Caitlin realized that some lies can lead to the greatest truths, and that sometimes, when we lose everything, it's when we find what really matters. Her cell phone vibrated with one last message from Richard. "You'll regret this, Bethany." But for the first time in 3 years, she felt no fear. Because now she was no longer alone, and together, she and Edward were unbeatable. The news spread like wildfire through New York's business circles. Gregory Ferraz had withdrawn his offer to buy Montgomery Enterprises. The company's shares soared, and the market was buzzing with speculation about the reasons for the sudden change of plans. In the penthouse of the Montgomery building, Caitlin watched the sunrise, an untouched cup of coffee in her hands. The previous night had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, and she was still trying to process everything that had happened. Couldn't sleep? Edward's voice surprised her. He was already impeccably dressed, despite the early hour. "I was thinking about Sarah," she admitted. "I need to find a way to help her, to correct the mistakes of the past." Edward approached, taking the cup from her hands and placing it on the table. "I've already arranged for her transfer to the best rehabilitation clinic in Switzerland. The fee. Doctors are specialists in psychological trauma." Caitlin stared at him, surprised. When?" "This morning, as soon as I woke up. It's all arranged." He smiled softly. "Your sister will have the best treatment possible." The tears Caitlin had been holding back since the night before finally overflowed. "Why? Why are you doing all this? For me?" "Because," Edward wiped her tears with his thumb, "at some point between pretending an engagement and discovering your secrets, I really fell in love with you." The confession hung between them like a delicate bubble. Caitlin felt her heart race, years of distrust and fear fighting against the overwhelming desire to give in to this feeling. "Edward, The moment was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Rebecca entered the room hurriedly, her usually calm face showing concern. "Sir, the police are here with a search and seizure warrant." Edward and Caitlin exchanged quick glances. "Richard," she murmured. "Keep calm," Edward instructed, adjusting his jacket. "Let's receive them." The police officers, led by an investigator from the Financial Crimes Division, got straight to the point. They had a warrant to search for evidence related to the Boston case. "Miss Carter," the investigator addressed Caitlin using her real name, "or should I say Mrs. Montgomery, we have a detailed complaint about your involvement in the disappearance of $15 million 3 years ago." "Interesting," Edward intervened smoothly. "And who made this complaint?" "Mr. Richard Mendez presented substantial evidence this morning." Caitlin maintained her composure, years of practice in pressure situations coming to the fore. "I imagine he also mentioned his own involvement in the case." The investigator frowned. "What do you mean?" "Perhaps you should take a look at this." Edward offered a flash drive to the officer. "It contains all the records of fraudulent transactions carried out by Richard Mendez, including transfers to offshore accounts and forged documents to incriminate Bethany Carter." The police officers looked at each other, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "You'll also find," Caitlin added, her voice firm, "records of how he manipulated my sister Sarah Carter's investments, leading her to a nervous breakdown. All documents are authenticated and can be verified." The investigator took the flash drive cautiously. This considerably changes the panorama of the investigation. "Oh, and one more thing," Edward smiled. That smile that Caitlin already knew well, the smile of someone who had all the cards up his sleeve. "You might want to investigate the recent transactions between Richard Mendez and Gregory Ferraz. I'm sure you'll find interesting connections." After the police left, Caitlin collapsed on the sofa, the adrenaline finally subsiding. How did you know they would come? Richard is predictable. Edward sat beside her. When cornered, he always tries to use the system to his advantage, but this time we prepared the counterattack beforehand. We? She looked at him, intrigued. Yes, we. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. Don't you see? Everything that happened, my revenge against Isabella, your past in Boston, brought us here, together. And now, he smiled, we turn this farce into reality, if you want. Caitlin's heart raced. Are you proposing to me for real this time? I'm asking for much more than that. Edward knelt before her, taking a small box from his pocket. I'm asking for a partnership in life, in business, in everything, because you, Bethany Carter, are the only person who has ever challenged me, surprised me, and made me want to be better. Caitlin looked at the ring, a delicate piece of platinum with a single diamond, so different from the ostentatious jewels he had given her when everything was just an act. Yes, she answered, tears of happiness escaping her eyes. Yes to everything. As Edward slid the ring onto her finger, Caitlin felt as if a cycle had been completed. From Bethany to Caitlin, from maid to fiancée, from victim to survivor. Each version of her had led them to this moment. Her cell phone vibrated with a message. It was from Sarah. The doctors told me about Switzerland. Thank you, Beth, and tell Edward he's much better than Richard ever was. P.S. Save a place for me at the wedding? Caitlin laughed through tears, showing the message to Edward. He pulled her into his arms, and there, in the warmth of his embrace, she finally found what she had always searched for, a place to belong. You know, she murmured against his chest, for someone who planned to use marriage as revenge, you turned out quite well in the role of a loving fiancé. Edward laughed, a rich and true sound that she was learning to love. And for someone who was hiding a secret past, you were a surprisingly honest fiancé. Maybe, she raised her face to look at him, some lies lead us to the greatest truths. And some revenges, he completed, leaning in to kiss her, lead us to true love. Outside, the New York sun shone on a city that never stopped. But there, in that moment, time seemed suspended. Because sometimes when we lose everything, we find exactly what we needed. And sometimes, fate has a peculiar sense of humor, turning games of revenge into love stories. The afternoon sun illuminated the courtroom of the New York Central Forum, where Richard Mendez's fate was about to be decided. Caitlin, seated in the front row next to Edward, watched her former mentor handcuffed at the defendant's table. The prosecution had built a solid case with the evidence she had provided. The evidence from the flash drive, combined with testimonies from other defrauded investors, painted a devastating picture of fraud and financial manipulation. The defense calls Mrs. Sarah Carter to testify, Richard's lawyer announced. Caitlin felt Edward squeeze her hand as Sarah entered the room. After 3 months of treatment in Switzerland, her sister looked like a different person. The lost look had given way to a serene determination, and her posture exuded a newfound strength. Mrs. Carter, the lawyer began, is it true that your sister Bethany Carter was responsible for managing your investments? Yes, Sarah answered in a clear voice, but not in the way you're implying. Bethany tried to warn me about the irregularities she discovered in the funds managed by Richard Mendez. And why didn't you listen to her? Because Richard had manipulated not only the numbers but also my trust. Sarah looked directly at her former financial advisor. He used our friendship, my inexperience, to convince me to invest more and more. Bethany discovered the scheme and tried to protect me. The lawyer changed strategy. And the disappearance of the money. How do you explain that? The documents already presented to the court, Sarah responded calmly, clearly show the path of the money. The transfers to offshore accounts, the shell companies created by Richard. My sister didn't steal anything. She preserved the evidence that is exposing the truth today. At the defendant's table, Richard seemed to have aged 10 years. His empire was crumbling and he knew it. During the court recess, Caitlin encountered Isabella in the hallway of the forum. Edward's ex-fiancée looked worn, still processing the news that Gregory would also be indicted for his participation in the scheme. "I didn't know," Isabella murmured as Caitlin passed by her. "About Richard, about Gregory's plans. I really didn't know." Caitlin stopped, studying the woman who had once been her rival. "Sometimes our choices lead us down paths we didn't plan." "Like you and Edward," Isabella gave a sad smile. "It was in the papers today. The wedding will be next month." "Yes." Caitlin hesitated before adding, "You know, Isabella, sometimes we lose something good to find something even better. You'll find your way too." Back in the courtroom, the judge was ready to announce his decision. Richard Mendez was sentenced to 10 years in prison for financial fraud and market manipulation. Additionally, he would have to reimburse all the defrauded investors. "It's over," Edward whispered, embracing Caitlin as they left the forum. "You managed to clear your name." "We managed," she corrected, "and we still have a lot of work ahead of us." He smiled, understanding the reference. In the last week, the Board of Montgomery Enterprises had unanimously approved Caitlin's appointment as the company's new CFO. Her experience and knowledge, now fully recognized, would be fundamental for the international expansion they were planning. The next day, during breakfast on the terrace of the Montgomery mansion, Caitlin was browsing the newspaper when a headline caught her attention. "Gregory Ferraz resigns from company presidency amid financial scandal. It seems our cousin will finally face the consequences of his choices," Edward commented, pouring himself some coffee. "And his company. I heard a group of European investors is interested." He smiled mysteriously. "Actually, I thought we could take a look at it. It would be an interesting strategic acquisition." Caitlin laughed, always the businessman. "We're a team now, remember?" He took her hand, caressing the engagement ring. "In every sense." Sarah arrived for breakfast shortly after, carrying a folder with drawings. Since returning from Switzerland, she had discovered herself to be a talented artist, and her works were already attracting attention from important galleries. "I finished the wedding invitations," she announced, spreading the drawings on the table. Each invitation was a unique work of art, hand-painted with soft shades of blue and gold. "They're perfect," Caitlin hugged her sister, moved to see how she had recovered. "Oh, and this arrived for you." Sarah handed her an elegant envelope. It was an invitation to the most important charity event of the year, organized by New York's high society. The same event where, a year ago, Caitlin had made her first public appearance as Edward's fiancée. "Ironic, isn't it?" she commented. "A year ago, I was terrified at the idea of entering that hall. And now?" "Now," she smiled, "I can't wait to enter there as myself, as Bethany Carter Montgomery." Edward pulled her into his arms. "You know what's more ironic? I planned to use our marriage as revenge against Isabella, and in the end we found something much bigger," she completed, nestling into his embrace. Sarah observed the couple with a smile. "You know what they say. Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." On that sunny morning, surrounded by her new family, Caitlin finally felt that all the pieces of her life had fallen into place. The past, with its pains and secrets, had been necessary to bring her here. And the future? Well, the future had never looked so promising. "So," Edward asked, his eyes shining with that look she had learned to love, "ready for our next adventure, Mrs. Montgomery?" Caitlin smiled, thinking about how life had a peculiar way of turning lies into truths, revenge into love, and losses into even greater gains. "With you?" She kissed him softly. "Always." St. Patrick's Cathedral had never looked so imposing as on that Saturday morning. The spring sun streamed through the historic stained glass windows, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that danced over the elegantly dressed guests who filled the rows of century-old pews. Caitlin observed her reflection in the mirror of the parish hall, where the final preparations for the wedding were taking place. The dress, an exclusive creation in French lace and Italian silk, was both elegant and discreet, exactly as she had dreamed. "It's perfect," Sarah smiled, adjusting her sister's veil. As maid of honor, she wore a light blue dress that matched the hydrangea arrangements decorating the cathedral. "I never thought I'd get here," Caitlin confessed, holding her sister's hands. "After everything that happened in Boston." "But you did," Sarah interrupted with a serene smile. "And the right way this time." Beatrice Mendez, who had become a true friend over the past year, gave the final touches to the bride's makeup. "Remember the first time we met? I was sure it would be impossible to transform a maid into a society lady. And now? Now I know. You never needed to be transformed," Beatrice smiled. "You just needed to go back to being who you always were." A soft knock on the door announced the arrival of Rebecca, the housekeeper, who had been a silent witness to the entire transformation. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she handed Caitlin an envelope. "This arrived this morning. It's from Isabella." Caitlin carefully opened the envelope, recognizing the elegant handwriting of her former rival. "Dear Caitlin, or Bethany, I still don't know what you prefer to be called. I won't be present at your wedding, but I wanted you to know that I'm happy for you both. The time in rehab helped me realize many things, especially that sometimes we lose something good to make room for something even better. Edward deserves someone who loves him for who he is, not for what he represents. And you, surprisingly, are exactly that. Take good care of him. Fondly, Isabella P.S. I'm moving to Paris, a new beginning as you taught me was possible." Caitlin folded the letter with an emotional smile. It was the closure of a cycle she didn't know she needed. In the cathedral's main nave, Edward waited at the altar, impeccable in his Italian tuxedo. By his side, as best man, stood Albert Mendoza, the board member who had become his greatest ally at Montgomery Enterprises. The music began, not the traditional wedding march, but a soft violin melody that Sarah had composed especially for the occasion. When the cathedral doors opened and Caitlin appeared, a collective murmur of admiration ran through the guests. She walked alone down the aisle. There was no father to give her away, but that didn't matter. Each step represented her journey, from Bethany to Caitlin and back to herself, stronger and truer than ever before. The vows were exchanged with an emotion that surprised all who knew the couple only by their public image. Edward, always so composed, had tears in his eyes when he declared his love. Caitlin, in turn, spoke about second chances and how some encounters, even if beginning for the wrong reasons, can lead to the most right destinations. The reception took place in the gardens of the Montgomery mansion, transformed into a fairy tale setting with thousands of lights and flowers. Among the guests, important figures from the business world mingled with former mansion employees, a decision by the couple that reflected their new life philosophy. During the party, Edward pulled Caitlin away for a private moment in the winter garden, their special place in the mansion. "Happy?" he asked, enveloping her in his arms. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied, nestling into his embrace. "You know, when you proposed that crazy deal a year ago, I thought I was just trading one mask for another. And I thought I was using you to get revenge on Isabella." Edward laughed softly. "Look where we ended up. Exactly where we should be." She raised her face to look at him. "You gave me back much more than a name or a social position, Edward. You gave me back myself. And you taught me that sometimes we need to lose control to find what really matters." The party continued. Well into the night, Sarah performed a song she had composed for the couple, her clear and strong voice filling the garden with a melody that spoke of new beginnings and second chances. When it was time to leave for the honeymoon, Caitlin made one last stop at her old maid's room. The small notebook that had held her secrets for so long was on the bed. "Aren't you going to take it?" Edward asked, watching her from the doorway. "No," she smiled, leaving the notebook on the dresser. "I don't need it anymore. My story is now lived in the light of day without secrets." At the airport, while waiting for the private jet that would take them to the Maldives, Caitlin received one last message from Sarah. "Beth, the gallery loved my new series of paintings. They're calling it Metamorphosis, paintings that show the transformation of a butterfly, inspired by someone I know. Love you, sis. Be happy." Caitlin showed the message to Edward, who smiled. Your sister always knew how to capture the essence of things. How so? You're like that butterfly. You had to go through a painful transformation to discover your true wings. The flight announcement interrupted the moment. As they walked to the boarding gate, hand in hand, Caitlin thought about how life had curious ways of working. A farce had turned into truth, a revenge into love, and a lie into redemption. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked when they were already in the air. "About how some endings are actually just disguised beginnings." He smiled, that smile that still made her heart race. "And what beginning do you want to write now, Mrs. Montgomery?" Caitlin looked out the plane window, the setting sun painting, the sky with the same colors as the cathedral's stained glass. One that is ours, completely ours. And so as the plane cut through the skies towards the future, Caitlin knew that she was finally at peace with all her versions, Bethany, Caitlin, and now, simply herself. Because sometimes the greatest love we can find is not just for another person, but for who we truly are. Dear readers, Caitlin and Edward's journey shows us that life's greatest treasures can emerge from the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives that explore the complexities of love, redemption, and new beginnings. Leave your like and share your own transformation stories in the comments. Each week, we bring new stories that make us believe in the power of true love. Until next time.